All right, so it is Thursday, the 16th of December, 2021. Dion Jensen here, founder of the Lion Academy with the Honourable Mark Mitchell, National Party, has a portfolio for Minister of Police. And what else, Mark? Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, Dion, first of all, thanks for having me on, mate. I really admire and appreciate the work that you do through the Lion Academy. I was honoured to be at Parliament when you launched your book there with Ron Mark. And so it's great to be part of the session today. Just very quickly about myself is that I did have a 14-year policing career, most of it spent on the New Zealand Police Dog Section and in our Armed Offenders Squad. And I had a career, international business career overseas. And then, of course, I became a member of Parliament in 2011 and was hugely privileged to serve as a National Defence Minister and in the Cabinet, and now, of course, in opposition. And the portfolios that I currently hold are police, counter-terrorism and serious fraud office.
Fantastic. And I love being able to talk to someone that's been frontline at higher levels than myself, for the record, because what we're about to talk about and the reason why this whole interview exists is I've got over 300,000 people in my network. And here in New Zealand, a lot of them are either ex-military, my veteran community, or they're police. And I'm still dealing with suicidal serving members and ex-members. And I'm the person in the organization they come to, and they don't want anyone else to know that they're dealing with stuff. And you and I both know through our connections that we've both lost people to suicide in and out of uniform. And confidentiality is key. It doesn't mean that they can't function and go out there and do their jobs. They just need some assistance with getting through. So the whole purpose and the reason why I asked for you to come on here is a lot of my people don't feel like we have open communication with our ministers. And for the record, I'm apolitical. Helen Clark's helped a lot with advising us with protecting women. Ron Mark's done an amazing job for us for veterans, helping us launch the book and still supporting a lot of the foster kids and youth offenders that I'm dealing with. Ron's still helping with them. Jacinda has helped us when we've emailed when I'm dealing with suicidal members from other government departments. She's been quick to get onto the minister and get them onto me. So across the board, I've had a very good relationship with all different political parties, only for the purpose of helping my people. And so I'll put down some questions that a lot of us are talking about, especially in the 10-7 group on Facebook, which anyone watching this, they'll see it in there. And a lot of us that probably feed a lot of information into the ministry. We've got amazing ex-special forces guys that have started their own companies. They're advising the government, especially in your portfolio. So this is just I'm asking questions so that you can give us a live response, and no one from any mainstream media is going to muck around with this edit. So I'm going to ask you some questions point blank, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
All righty. And just before I start that, a shout out to my mum, Marilyn Jensen. Yeah. I was a young soldier when I first got my first hiding from a dog handler. His name was Tiny Sanderson. Yeah. And I think there was a get-together at our house in Whiteman's Valley. There's a few of you there. And I made the mistake of saying to Tiny Sanderson, "Aren't you a little old to be a police dog handler?" I woke up in the garden with a newfound respect for police dog handlers. So I'll just put that out there for the record. So here's a really important question, Mark. In your opinion, are police feeling valued and supported out there on the street as far as you're concerned?
I think we still have, we enjoy our, number one, the New Zealand Police Force, in my view, is the best police, most professional police service in the world. And I think that I can speak from a place of authority on that because I had a big career overseas dealing with many law enforcement agencies from not only our partner countries, but lots of other nations as well. So without a doubt, we've got the best people and the best service. And I think there's very high levels of public support. And I hope that our police feel that, certainly the front line. Right at the moment, I feel that there's not enough support coming from the police leadership. And I think there's very weak support and direction coming from the government through the current minister. So that's the reason why I asked for the police portfolio, because I think our police have been put in a terrible situation where they're dealing with a huge rise in gang numbers. There's more illegal firearms on the street, and actually these gang members now are more inclined to use them. So, our police are in a tough spot, and actually that requires some really strong leadership and support flowing down both politically and through their own leadership.
Yeah, a couple of things you did there. You and I both work globally, so we're a little bit we're a different animal to a lot of people here in New Zealand. And I watch you do the immediate switch between police force and police service. overseas their police forces. There's weapons, there's the threat level so much higher back then. I think we're catching up. But the New Zealand police is a police service. Our role in the New Zealand police hasn't changed to reduce the incidences and effects of crime through the detection and apprehension of offenders, maintaining law and order, and enhancing public safety. We are a police service. We don't want to ever be perceived out there as the police force enforcing on our own people. And it's nice to hear you make that immediate shift in your narrative. From what I'm reading and what I'm feeling, and I'm dealing with those offenders, part of the Lion Academy program, I'm dealing with youth offenders between 14 and 19 years old, trying to stop them going on that path. They're fried on meth, mate, and they're carrying firearms. My 14 to 19-year-olds, the guys I deal with, point blank. So I know that for a fact. So I'm working with these guys, trying to stop them from doing that. As we know, a lot of these kids and a lot of these younger criminals, and when I say criminal, that's not the label for who they are as a human being, but for what they're particularly doing on this side. Once they're fried on that pipe, mate, and they're carrying a firearm, all bets are off. And the dialogue for my people is they don't feel supported in regards to the threat that's on the street right now. And the dialogue that we're having, or the narrative that we're having, is there's this limbo space created with the tenor, with the threat assessment. Should we be routinely armed? So everyone's arguing about being routinely armed, as opposed to we can actually arm ourselves as a New Zealand Police Service if we do our own risk assessment. So the question I'd like to ask, just in regards to that structure, is where does this go? Where does the minister sit? Where does the police commissioner sit? How does that then filter down to like the regional commanders? What's that authority line? Can the police minister say, yep, we're going to arm? Or that's not his role, it's the police commissioner to say that. What's that space look like? Because I don't know the answer.
Well, there's operational separation there in terms of the police minister always retains operational independence and autonomy, and that's very important. So ultimately that'll be a decision for the police leadership, by the police commissioner. Look, I think my feeling is I'm very clear about this. If you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have been against general arming policy, because I was sort of hanging on to that romantic notion that we're one of the last unarmed constabularies in the world, and that we should not let that go lightly. But the fact of the matter is that we're asking our police officers now to go out there and face daily, well organised, well resourced, more dangerous gang members that are far more comfortable using violence against police and the public, and in a lot of cases they're better armed than our frontline officers. So, working through some good policies that mean that our police officers have got every tactical option available to them to deal with the situations that may arise. And I mean, I sat through the court case in relation to David Goldfinch, the attempted murder of David Goldfinch by Eli Epihar, and of course the murder of Constable Matthew Hunt. Those guys had no tactical options at all. And when you hear the pretty harrowing evidence that David Goldfinch, who showed enormous resilience and presence of mind to be able to get himself out of the situation, he was being chased around a four-wheel drive vehicle with Ebihar shooting at him with a high-powered rifle. He had no ability to defend himself. Matthew had no tactical options. He couldn't close the distance between himself and the offender when he got out of the vehicle. He had to go and try and get some cover from fire. And of course, he was shot 3 times in the back doing that. So that's not acceptable. Our police are part of our community. They're one of us, and we ask them to go out there and do a very good job on behalf of society. So it's extremely important that, number one, we get behind and we support them, and that we make it very, very clear that they need to have the training, the tactical option, so that we don't see those cases reoccurring. Because the reality of it is, that sort of situation was a broad daylight, on the streets of West Auckland, and it was a traffic stop. Police are doing thousands of those every day. So I think it's me personally, that's my position on it now. The first thing that we could do in terms of making it safer on the streets is take a much harder line against the gangs and actually start to put some pressure on them, use every resource and tool that's available to the police and other agencies to really start putting the squeeze on the gangs and sending a very clear message that actually you're not going to take over public spaces. You're not going to take over roads. If you want to have illegal firearms, let's give them the powers to take those away from them and start to give the police an advantage over these gangs who are highly organised, well-resourced, and a lot more violent now.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, some gold nuggets for people watching this right now, and for any police members watching this right now. Yeah, we're going to talk about the legal responsibility and the legal liability and Ted on that side in a second. But for any members of the public that are watching this now, when we start talking about gangs and public spaces, even the gang world has changed here. There was still a code where, you know, churches, public places, maraes, and certain places were hands off. You didn't bring any of that rubbish there. If you had an issue, you went somewhere, you went and sorted it out. But it was never brought to the public forum, and it's not supposed to go anywhere near the family house. A lot of the gang members that I dealt with as a community cop who had left the gang were because those core values had been breached. They were prospecting kids too young, or they were, you know, doing drive-by shootings of whānau houses where nan and granddad were. And so even within gangland, a lot of that has changed because of meth, because people are just off their head, right? So I even saw Dennis O'Reilly even came out and was like, man, you cops need to be armed, because even what we're seeing, we can't control a lot of these guys as well when they're fried. So I agree that we're losing that public space. For someone to get out in broad daylight and execute one of our members, and then for anyone to spin around and say, well, we shouldn't routinely arm police. It's only in sort of 3 lanes that I'm hearing a different narrative. First one was this rubbish firearms accessibility. And for those of us, myself included, that have bullets coming the other way, having your weapon locked in a safe in the back of the car is not going to help you.
That's fundamentally one of the debates that we need to have, or the police need to sort through, and they are doing a full review around staff safety at the moment. But I agree with you, and I think that you know, accessibility is something that needs to be addressed. Police officers, there's no way that either David or Matthew had time to get to the boot of their car, unlock a safe, and take a weapon out. It's not practical in the real world. The other thing I would say, Dion, really quickly addressing the issue that you raise around these youth offenders, you know, this is a social investment problem. So this is intergenerational. These are really hard, crunchy issues to get into. It takes a big commitment from the government of the day to get alongside these families, and actually with a program that stays with them until you start to move them out of the gangs, or, you know, back into rejoining society, allowing young people to be in a different environment where there's aspiration and they get onto a different pathway. But right now, our police officers, if you talk to the frontline guys, their biggest frustration is dealing with offenders as young as 10. That are using meth and drugs, and that are stealing vehicles, and have got no concept at all really in terms of what they're doing. And that they're a huge danger to themselves, they're a huge danger to the frontline police officers and to the public. And you know, they're deeply frustrated because often they'll catch these youth offenders and the next night they'll be out reoffending again. So the criminal justice system is not supporting the police the way it should be at the moment, and that's an issue that really needs to be looked at and addressed as well.
And the police can't fix this. And this is one of the questions I'm going to put for later for the public perceptions. The police cannot fix this. This is a psychosocial and a social policy issue, right? And so in the Lion Academy, we actually have those programs. We've got 14-year-olds to 19-year-olds, and we're going to be building our own villages so we can work through that whole cycle and out. The police cannot solve crime starting.
That's right.
That's not our role. Our role is to reduce the incidences and effects of crime.
Absolutely.
It's got to be a different side. So as a police officer, you are frontline safety, you are then the social worker, and then even as a community cop, we're trying to grab from anywhere to support this family. This kid is doing ag robs of petrol stations to get cigarettes, to get money to pay for food. So the causative issue for that particular kid is they've got no money for food. And then, so why don't they have money? Because all these other things are happening with mum and dad. And so that's where we're in that space as well. But if we lose the front line, you lose everything else. It's the same for anything. You've got your perimeter on every policy, on every mission that we have. If we lose the frontline ability to protect ourselves, we lose the frontline ability to protect the public.
Absolutely.
And so,
look, and the police don't get to choose who they go and deal with. They have to deal with what's put in front of them. And but they have got a big role to play in the broader social investment type, trying to unlock and stop that intergenerational sort of offending and you know, gang membership and things like that. Because of course they're on the front line. They're only 24/7 social service, so they have a big role to play, and they can partner with other agencies. But to lay it all at the feet of the police and say, hey, you've got to go out there and fix these issues, it's totally unreasonable, and they can't. And what fundamentally their first role is to protect the communities without fear or favour, and deal with what's put in front of them. And that's so it's very unfair when a lot of the stats get rolled out from government around overrepresentation, things like that. That is not the police's fault. They deal with what's put in front of them. And if we want to get serious as a country,
well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about some stats for a second. So one thing that I've noticed, I've been away overseas and I've come back 17 years ago. I was a community constable here in Palmy and AP and Awapuni, and I'm still in this community. I still know people from the community. And what I've seen is this huge separation from who we're recruiting for the police and who they're policing. Like, I mean, once upon a time, we're in New Zealand, where the English invaded and did all of these things. And then when we have a huge policing issue in South Auckland, we go to England and we recruit a whole lot of English police officers and we put them in South Auckland. And now we're wondering why there's this huge gap between the police and the communities that we're policing. I remember, and I hate when people say, back when I was a cop, but this is a really important issue. I can still run into anyone I dealt with as a police officer, whether I've had a punch up with them, whether they've tried to stab me, or whether I've locked them up, and we still get on. Yeah. Because we are still in the same community. We're going to run into each other at Pack and Save when I'm shopping for my kids' lunches. But now what I see is the police that I deal with and the youth offenders that I deal with, or adult offenders now out of prison, there's absolutely zero relationship between that police officer and that person. And so that broader sense of that involvement, now we shut down community police stations, we shut down all those satellite police stations, and then now we're reaping what we sow. So one of the first things I'd like to see is, listen, if we've got issues with Pacific Island kids in South Auckland, shouldn't we be recruiting Pacific Island police officers?
Listen, I agree with you completely. I think that one of the fundamentals, I know when I went through police college, it was sort of drummed into us that police are public and public are police. And the communities that the police are policing want to see their police reflected back as themselves. And so I agree with you completely that a big Pacific Island community is going to want to see good Pacific Island police officers. The Chinese community enjoys seeing Chinese police officers. Our Maori community enjoys seeing good Maori police officers. And so I think that the police have to reflect back the community society that they're serving. I agree completely. And I did most of my policing in Gisborne up on the East Coast. I mean, from Ruatoria down to Wairoa. And I'd say probably half of my colleagues were Maori police officers from the coast, and it strengthened us as a police, because they understood the community, they were linked into the community, and it didn't mean that other police officers aren't as professional and proficient and can't do the job, but I just think that actually your police service reflecting back the community that they're policing is actually a really helpful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing you mentioned is the training, and so the initial narrative that people are like, hey, why should we routinely arm? Why shouldn't we routinely arm? Let's just talk about the weapon systems for a moment, because a lot of the public don't understand this. If you've got a long or an M4 or 80 sort of rifle, back with the 223 with the bolt action back in our day, that was the side for the range of everything else. Your Glock or your revolver back in the day, that's your personal protective weapon. That's not the weapon you're running around trying to enforce anything. That's for you to keep you safe. So if I'm doing a 3-2 and I'm pulling a car over and all of a sudden someone jumps out for a knife, I should be able to drop what I'm doing and protect myself. If I've got the ability to create distance and get away, cordon and contain and bring down defenders, and I'm going to try and do that every time. I'm not interested in getting in a gunfight. Why? Because I don't want to get shot. I don't want my bullets going anywhere else. But I want the ability to protect myself if someone jumps out with knives or a different conversation. Like, people are worried about firearms. I'm more worried about knives. There's a lot of time you don't see it coming. If someone's going to jump out for a shotgun, that's a pretty clear tactical option. That's a firearm. I've got a firearm. I'm going to protect myself. If I can leave, I'm going to leave. But I can't leave the public there. So the other thing is with the routinely arming is, yes, there's police must have the ability to protect themselves, which is law. The New Zealand police is supposed to provide a safe working environment. We've got to have all the tactical ability to protect ourselves. We don't. That's in our legislation. We don't have access to protect ourselves. So I think if they split that narrative between police having the ability to have all tactical options to defend themselves first, and then the public second, then that becomes a different conversation where you don't get everything else leaked in the middle. And while we're talking about this, let's just squash this one because you and I hate this one. Why aren't we teaching our police members to shoot for arms or legs? Why are we always going for centre mass?
Back in my day, it was centre mass, and it was quite simply because if you'd reached the point where you had to use deadly force and you had to stop an offender, then the most effective way and the safest way to do that was centre mass.
Absolutely, and the effective and the safe for a centre mass shot is effective because that's got the most stopping power for the person that's going to, because you've got to fear death, right, or death or grievous bodily harm. But the other thing is that's the effective. On the safe side is, I don't know, I don't care how good a shot you are, aiming for arms and legs is just not practical. But if you miss a small target and your bullet hits a member of the public, that was the safe side. Centre mass, greater stopping power, biggest target for you to aim for, and less chance of your rounds going somewhere else.
That's right.
We just wanted to squash that.
No, I agree. And I think if the police officer is in a situation where they're having to draw and use a weapon, then there's probably a fair bit of adrenaline. There's a lot happening. And so, you know, to try and do targeted shots on a limb is probably not realistic. And at the end of the day, Dion, as we know, train, because it's muscle memory. And that's what you revert back to when the pressure and the stress comes on.
And this is the other issue. So this is the other gap now. So if we take our minds back to Waitara, way back then, police GIs, it was the sergeant that had that wore the responsibility for arming their staff, right? And then after what happened in Waitara, that changed. They went, right, every police officer makes their own decision now, because all that liability came to the leadership, you know, for a decision that's made by someone else. So that changed, so that then the legal responsibility was the individual officer. Now we actually have a mechanism, the tenor here, where I can identify that the threats out there at the moment, like night shift handover notes is, we pulled a car over last night and guy pulled a shotgun on us. That's good enough for me. I'm gonna at least carry a sidearm. I'm going to protect myself. So I'm going to be stopping cars on my shift, right? So that should be enough. Now we're in that space where the training, 10,000 hours for muscle mindset with all the drills that we do. There is not sufficient firearms training for frontline staff. That's what I'm hearing. And without breaching confidentiality, and I'm not here to point any fingers, the simple fact of the matter is, when a lot of these reviews after shootings were conducted, you know, not everyone was up to speed, not everyone was qualified, because there wasn't the amount of training that was required. I know you haven't looked at the training because you picked a portfolio, but with your background when it comes to this sort of stuff, how often are we going to be expecting our staff to go through firearms training in a calendar year, where we would expect them to be proficient in protecting themselves?
Look, I don't know the exact number on that, but one thing I would say is that if the Commissioner decided to go to a general arming type policy, then there'd have to be a significant amount of resource put into trainers and a lot more training for frontline police staff, because I don't feel that the training they get at the moment is sufficient, and I think that most of them would agree with that. Certainly back in my day, I mean, I was on the under offender squad, so we did a lot more firearms training than general duties. But there's other options as well. I mean, I was invited out by the Singaporean government about 3 years ago when I had the justice portfolio, and I visited their police academy there. They've invested heavily in technology and shoot don't shoot suites, and where the staff at any time can go and sign in with an instructor, and they can just about plug in any scenario, and then they can test their response and their decision making. And I just think that we'd have to heavily invest in that sort of technology, so that staff had a lot more training, were put under pressure, and they had their decision making tested, so they were confident about that. And you know, and that way you actually end up upskilling your police service a lot more if you get the gangs under control, and you were to come out with policies that made, even if it wasn't a general arming policy, made firearms more accessible. Then all of a sudden you're starting to lower the risk to your frontline police officers, and thereby lowering the risk to the public as well. Because I do agree with you that a Glock is a personal protection weapon for an officer and an additional tactical option for them. But let's remember that that if the offender gets through that police officer, then it's the public that then become immediately at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the training side, we have a wealth of experience in this country. Generally, the training at police squad is outstanding. Like, we all know the people that are down there and instructing and how that all works. We have a wealth of skills and experience. We have the people. And the amount of experience that many of us have got, a lot of us are instructors, and a lot of the other stuff that we've done, we've always been asked to come in behind closed doors to test all this technology. We've all done those shoot, don't shoot scenarios and been asked for our feedback from how we would utilize this on the circuit and how we would do this. And I remember I went through there, and like, this is all unofficial because they know that we have the skills and the experience to be able to give some live, after action report feedback to say, okay, in this scenario, I've been in this scenario before. And when I was going through doing the shoot, don't shoot scenarios, as soon as you walked in, you did your scanning, you just sit there pointing at the threat direction because you knew that's where it was going to come from after the information that you processed. And then they're asking us questions, right? Why have you discounted this and why are you pointing in that direction? Because they go through in the little cursor, they show where your muzzle's going when they do the analytics. I said, because that's logical. I've been in that situation before, and that's the only place the threat can come from. But for all their design capability, they didn't understand that because they hadn't been there. And so here in New Zealand, we've got a wealth of experience that can help with that. And I think that's generally been utilized quite well, even though a lot of it's, unofficial. But it's the time, like you say, it's the accessibility for training. I mean, if we, and I'm not using the US model for anything because we're not the US, but for their technology at any stage, they can pop downstairs in the station and go down the range and let a few rounds go and go through some scenarios, and they can keep the skill up. But the other gap I'm seeing, and this is me talking about the mental health side, it's up here that gets you through that stuff. Everything else is just as a skill. This is what gets you through. The ability to tactically assess what's going on at speed and make the right decision. And you can't do that without a certain amount of hours training or live operation experience. It was operational confidence that I was teaching them. I mean, they're all ninjas. They're super fit. Their weapons drills are outstanding. Their groupings like this, far better than that. But when the heat come down, you threw aggression, you threw rage, and you threw fear at it. It's like, oh, because they didn't have the mental training, the mental mindset training. That's an area that we're really looking at. So I know you're going to have a look at all that training, and I'll come back to these questions. So anyone watching this is like, Dion, that was a long-winded answer. There's a reason for that, because a lot of the people in our generation, they're now all instructors. And so what I'm seeing in the group now is we've got experienced police officers that have had that level of training or experience. They're quite comfortable filling out a tenner, grabbing a Glock, signing it out, and I'm going to go home safe to my family. But I think we're leaving a group of our police officers behind that aren't confident in actually going out there and doing the job they're expecting to do. And they're saying that, well, listen, if it comes from on top that we have to be routinely armed, it takes a lot of that pressure off. But I'd like to see some more mindset training in regards to that. So back to our questions. Anything to say on that, Mark, before I go next one?
No, I just think, they're good points. I think that I think what I'm waiting to see is this this report that's going to be it's going to be generated through the review that they're doing around staff safety, and see what they've identified. Obviously, listening to the front line and getting their feedback. The Police Association did a survey recently where 75% of frontline police officers, about 75% of frontline police officers, felt like they had to move to a general arming policy to protect themselves and to have that tactical option. I mean, that's a massive, that's a massive red flag right there in terms of listening to your frontline staff and figuring out what you need to do to put them in the best possible position to deal with what they have to deal with on a daily basis.
That's the other reason for this interview. We should be able to have this dialogue. And one thing this was actually my last question, but we'll come back, is if we could make a humble request, the people that I'm representing, and I don't represent them, I'm just representing people in my academy and my network, is creating a forum for people to actually be able to put this information in without fear of retribution by the department. And it's not through some sort of survey from the police, just an open forum. We can do this with anonymous sides of things. I can sit here and, hey, this, and this, and people can talk back to it. Because I think we're losing that communication channel. And you and I both know, if you want to go in and take control of an area, the first thing you do is shut down communications. And so that's why we're trying to open this communication up.
Look, I agree with you. And in all fairness to the Commissioner, Andy Costa, I was talking to him the other day at the High Court in Auckland, and I asked him this, and he did assure me and say that they are surveying and that they are genuinely seeking feedback from the front line in terms of what's going on. So I'd take him on his word and hope that is happening because it is critically important, without a doubt. I think in relation to mental health, I mean, we've come a long way in this country in removing the stigma around that. We still have some way to go. And I just think that it's always a matter of just reaching out. And it's easy to say, because when people get into a funk in a dark space and and they're depressed. It's not always that easy. You can say, look, just reach out. Why aren't you talking to someone? But actually, you know what? Organisations like yours, there's a lot more sensitivity and focus around trying to support and make sure that those with depression or mental health issues are properly supported and made to feel like they're properly supported. And I think
I'm going to respectfully challenge you on that one, Mark, because I believe that we've slayed the stigma of killing yourself. I don't think we've slayed the stigma of feeling suicidal at all. I think we've slayed the stigma of killing yourself. And we have got better in asking people to speak out, but there's no trust there. Like, and so here's the fears. Like, you might reach out for help and you're going to get rubber stamped.
Yeah.
And then you're going to go down. And I know how that whole process works. I speak to the EAPs, the employee assistance programs, from that. The amount of police that speak to me all say the same thing. I can't let anyone know I'm going through this, whether they're an EAP, whether my psycho, someone's going to find out about it and it's going to be used against me. Before the bullying stuff that I've dealt with, and I'm not talking about police here, before the bullying stuff that I'm dealing with, medical confidentiality is still not trusted now, because what's happening if, let's just say we're out there on the street, we deal with something, we've gone to a cop death, and that's just rocked us, and you wake up the next morning and it's like, man, I can't deal with this today. You call in sick, it goes over 3 days and you produce a medical certificate. That was supposed to be the end of it. Now there's this document that's going around all the government departments, which I'll talk to the Minister of Health when I find out who it is after the next election. And this document is getting written into policy to say, oh, can you tell me the nature of your sickness so that we can better support you?
Yeah, look, I agree with you entirely. And I think that without a doubt, if people are going to be reluctant to step forward and say, hey, I need some help, if they feel like their career is going to be interfered with or their chosen role is going to be changed or something like that. And I think that, any organisation, including the police, has to have a really robust system in place to clearly map out and show what support can be given. And at the end of the day, it's always about public safety. That's got to be the number one. And I think any serving police officer would agree with that. In terms of them getting support, but also making sure that neither they nor the public are going to be put in a difficult position. But clearly map out with them and show them pathway. Yep. So you may temporarily move out of the role that you want, but this is the pathway to move back into it. And if they have confidence in that, then they're going to come forward and they're going to seek help. If they don't, then they're going to limp along and try and deal with it themselves, and probably end up in a worse situation. So I agree with you completely on that. Being part of an organisation that can actually not only deal with what the issue is at that time in terms of health-based, but also recognise that this person has got a career and they've got aspirations and they've got roles that they want, and that those are still open to them in their future.
Absolutely. And two things on that. A shout out to the New Zealand Police Association. Very few associations are separate to the actual organisation that really champion their staff. And I think the New Zealand Police Association does a fantastic job.
Yep.
And if you speak to them and you go through your police association rep, 9 times out of 10, they're going to help. They're going to put things on the path. The other part where it might not be 10 out of 10 will just be something that falls through the gap. But generally in New Zealand Police Association are there 100% behind their staff. The second thing I would say on that is those that are exposed to a lot of the frontline trauma are frontline staff. So anyone watching this, if you think it's a good control measure to take that person who gets all of their value from being up the front and chuck them on a desk job at the back until you sort his issues out, that is not going to work. So I just want to put that in there for now. I really want to talk here about gangs because it's a touchy one, and I'll put that in there. It's going to be a touchy one, and I want to clearly separate these lanes. So when we talk about gangs, a lot of the time we wrap up every single family member that's a part of that gang. We say that they're all criminals and they're part of the gang. Yet under legislation, when we talk about gangs, we're talking about criminal gangs. Those gangs who are defined by legislation that are out there creating victims in our community. And not every single family member associated to that gang is a criminal at all. And so when we're talking in this vein about gangs, we're talking about those criminal gangs that are out there creating a threat to us, breaking the law, and can potentially kill people and hurt people for what they're doing, all the way from shooting someone all the way back to dealing drugs and everything else. And the lanes that we're dealing with now, when we're talking about the kids and everyone else, if we just lump everyone together, that whole whānau as the gang, and it's us and them, I think we're starting to slice too close to separating a lot of our community side. And if we can find a way to work, and look, the police at certain roles need to do this, but other organizations need to come in, but we've got to change the way we think about this problem and really get down and drill through and break up that gang demographic. There are people that are going to be gang members for life because that's their family. So we've got to think a little bit different. And our straight enforcement model is not going to work.
Yeah, look, listen, so my view on this is really simple, Dion, and I put this together in our justice policy package about 3 years ago, and I'm a huge believer in social investment. And
Yep.
by that, I mean the government getting into people's lives much earlier and staying with them much longer and giving them a whole range of support to try and get them, to try and change their lives and get their, especially those with kids, and bounce them onto a positive pathway where they can enjoy all the opportunities that this incredible country offers. And that they can rejoin society and their kids can have aspiration and, and a much more positive future and pathway in life. Any gang member right now that wants to leave a gang, I would get right alongside them and I'd make sure they got all the support that they needed, especially those with families, if they want to come and rejoin society. But if you continue to choose and be part of a gang that is operating as a criminal enterprise, then you have made a decision to reject society. You've made a decision to put your children into a bad situation where they're more likely to end up on a fast track into the criminal justice system. And I've got zero tolerance for that. And I think gangs are not a force for good; they're a force for evil. And that's my own personal opinion, and that's my own personal position on it. And you'll see if we're re-elected in 23, you'll see from me policies that will come out very, very clearly in terms of tackling the problem that we've got right in front of us now with gangs, but also alongside of that, very strong social investment policies whereby we want to get along, especially these intergenerational gang families. We want to find a way to be able to break the cycle and get them out and get them to rejoin society and like I said, take advantages of all the wonderful opportunities that this country actually provides.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been interesting seeing all these different lanes of all these organizations that we're working with. Like, we work with police, we work for Rangatamariki, corrections, probation. Having been in a lot of those roles, sort of seeing what the thinking is behind the strategic document, seeing Hawkeye Rangi coming out as a strategic document for corrections and starting to see now a more of a global approach to thinking about problems. I'm starting to see that narrative starting to come through in New Zealand, which is really important. But again, it's coming back to that, creating that space for everyone that has investment into. I mean, we look at an FGC, we look at a family group conference, we've got a young offender, we bring every single person associated to that kid to the table so everyone can throw something in to come up with that effective plan. And that's the thinking that I would like to see come for all of our issues across these portfolios. If you come in here as the Minister of Police, what's our main issues at the moment? We want to keep our staff safe so they can protect the community.
That's right.
We have to take a hard line on gangs, criminal activity where it affects the safety of our citizens, 100%. And then past that point, how do we then all carry on with all these other agencies as we go through and dealing with all these fastballs, earthquakes, floods, COVID, all that other sort of stuff after? And so we're going to apply the correct thinking to these things. I think we actually have all the components and the people to make this work, but we're just not hearing the communication of the thinking. And I know that myself and my particular network don't feel like there's nowhere for us to be able to, hey, I know how to fix that. Hey, I've got a solution to that. Where is that space for us to actually come into and contribute?
Well, I get, it makes me very sad. I've been dealing with gangs since I was 20 years old and became a young police constable here in New Zealand, and I've been involved in law enforcement overseas for many years. It makes me very sad with gangs because when you actually look inside them, there's some very charismatic, intelligent leaders sitting inside gangs, and if they channeled all that leadership ability, entrepreneurship, charisma into actually doing something positive for society, they could be a huge force for good. But they don't. They choose to be part of a criminal and organised crime network.
Well, I'm going to respectfully again challenge you on that particular word, and I have to because I have to put everything on the table, right? So, not all of our tamariki, not all of our rangatahi have the power to choose, Mark. like they don't. It's survival or do this or else. And let's start with a good example. I have a 14-year-old on the Lion Academy youth empowerment program called Ina Mana. Him and his brother were taken when he was 8 and his brother was 9 by SIFs because of the horrible environment they were in. Youth offender all the way through. Went from care and protection to youth justice, and he's been a youth offender all the way through. He's now 14. He's a videographer and an editor inside the Lion Academy. He's had all his district court, youth court charges all been discharged, and he is choosing, because we gave him the ability to choose, to use what he loves doing to become that side of society, because it starts with that inner mana. But you can't choose unless you've got choices, unless you've got options. And a lot of our kids and a lot of our people, they don't have a choice, mate.
But Dion, this is taking us into a much more deeper philosophical discussion. And I know that my views are shaped by my experience overseas. And I had a debate with Calvin Davis on this when he stood up and he said that, the guys that he grew up with in Kaikoui grew up in New Zealand with no opportunity and a dozen in the garage and fast track into the criminal justice system. I completely reject that, because I worked and lived in countries where people over there would give anything to have a home in Kaikoui, to be able to go to a free public education system and to have the opportunities that exist inside New Zealand. And unfortunately, you become desensitized to that when you're born into the environment and you don't actually understand what's sitting in front of you. And every single human being has got fundamentally, instinctively knows the difference between right and wrong. And so, I just don't, it's too easy to make excuses. And in my view, in this country, it's become too easy to sort of play the victim. And I know that's a tough thing to say, but actually, if we're not willing to have the really tough conversations, if we're not really willing to reset ourselves, and I was honoured to meet with the iwi leaders group in Waitangi about 4 years ago, and I had this conversation with them and said, you are the leaders, we are the leaders. If we're not willing to actually have really tough conversations and actually confront the leaders in the gangs, all of us, and say enough's enough, we're not putting up with it anymore, but here's the plan and here's what we want to do to get you guys to society, nothing's going to change. We're never going to, I'm not naive enough to say that we're never going to get rid of gangs completely. We're never going to, inherently there's just bad people that are not going to want to do an honest day's work, and they're going to try and find other easy ways of making money, right? So it's always going to be around, but we can certainly start to make that big fundamental intergenerational change that needs to happen. It takes a big commitment. It takes guys like you to be able to step up and actually be prepared to have the tough conversations and that has the mana to carry that to actually start to make the change. Because otherwise we end up wringing our hands and saying, oh, it's all bad, it's all too tough, it's all too hard. And we'll end up having the same conversation in 10 years' time.
Mate, this is a winnable fight. This is 100% a winnable fight. Like, we're not paid to lose, mate. But you've hit 3 key things on the head, which why I had to push and put that across here, because it's different lanes. You and I are a different animal. We've got global context. So I've been in Mindanao, I've been in Indo, I've dealt with triads, we've seen stuff that people in New Zealand are never going to see.
That's right.
Kids with a stub of a pencil like this just trying to learn math because that's their way out. And then people back here in New Zealand, because they don't have that, they don't have context. We've got context. Yep. The second thing is that open dialogue, that conversation. And so one of my favorite whakataukis, when I'm dealing with the Māori side, look, I'm half Samoan, so you'll see a Tulafale speaking chief behind me, actually painted by a serving member of ours, an ex-serving member of ours. But I was brought up in Ngāti Tūmatauenga, so I was brought up more te ao Māori than I was Samoan. And one of my favorite whakataukis, ko te kai a te rangatira he kōrero. The food of chiefs is dialogue. And so you've got context, you're having dialogue with iwi leaders, and you come up with a plan. That's the solution for New Zealand right now. Hey, let's bring this all into context. If we fast forward what we're doing now, where we're going to end up, it's not a nice place. So we've got to do something. What do? Let's bring in all this global context and all this experience and skills that we have for those of us that have it. Let's discuss this. Let's have this open dialogue with everyone, serving members, ex-members, the kid down the street that's like, hey, move it to the left, but let's create that and then come up with the strategy and then start implementing those plans. Those 3 things have not been hit consistently. We talk about one and we talk about it here and we talk about it there. And if we did that, we would find out that up until a certain point, kids don't have a choice. From the time that we give them all of those options, if they play stupid games, they win stupid prizes, boo-hoo, right? And so our role in the academy is to take them from a survival mode where they're going to do whatever it takes to survive. Right and wrong's out the window. They're going to do whatever it takes to survive. And I'm dealing with kids that have been raped by gang members, males, all the horrible stuff that you and I know about. Once they're out of survival mode, they have the ability, if we give them options, and I use Bob Marley. So every kid that's heard me speak, I use Bob Marley, hopes and dreams, ways and means. Yep. If we grow the hopes and dreams, combine them with ways and means, and give them that choice, if they choose wrong, too bad. All right. So I've got no issue with that. But until we can create those options where they can make those right choices, then I'm fully behind what you say if we have those three things. And that has to, we've got to create the space to have this dialogue amongst everyone. And a question just come in my head. Is there really, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, just come into my head. Is there really open dialogue between the current government and opposition? Like, can you sit there with your offside and actually have these discussions? I don't know.
Not at the moment, not as much as we'd like. And I don't want to turn the show political, but I think there's a lot of these issues that should have a bipartisan approach.
Yep.
But we're not. But the current government is very hard to engage with in terms of trying to have a bipartisan approach on some of these issues. And the reality of it is that part of the problem is we have an election cycle of 3 years, and so you never really get any good solid continuity through a big investment, social investment model that starts to change things, starts to make those generational changes. And, I just find it heartbreaking. I saw a video that went up on social media a couple of days ago with the Mungal mob, and one chapter had visited another chapter, and they were out saying goodbye. And there were two young guys out there, probably maybe 9 or 10 year olds, and obviously probably just good, clever young boys, right?
Yep.
And out there with Mungal mob regalia on, barking and using gang language, and I just thought, what chance have these kids got? How are we going to get them onto a track where they've got some aspiration, where they can go on to be a successful small business owner, or join the police service, or become a lawyer, or go overseas and take the opportunities that Kiwis are sought after, valued commodity overseas, because we're normally
which we are. I mean, our reputation is phenomenal. And then, so the last thing I'll say in regards to this is just pure logic. When you're in survival mode, go to school, get an education, get a good job. $25 an hour is what we're selling. That's what we're selling, right? Or go to university, get a degree and get a higher paying job, or become an entrepreneur, become a business person. That's what we're trying to sell as society to a lot of these kids. And uncles like, drop off this little plastic bag and I'll give you $1,000 a week, a Harley, 10 grand, and all the girls you want.
Absolutely.
So this is the sales mechanism that we're dealing with at the moment. It's either or, and it's not going to work until we put some stuff in the middle. And for New Zealand specifically, we have this superpower that no one else in the world has. We have mana, right? And so how many gang members, how many people have spun their life around because of marae, or because of church, or because of a higher spiritual power, that sense of belonging and engaging that in the mana that supersedes all of that stuff. And you would have seen it, especially up on the East Coast. Some maraes you can't wear your patch to. And they don't not wear their patch because they're going to get in trouble. They don't wear their patch because Nanny said you can't when you come to this marae. So again, this is a winnable fight. If we're smart, strategic, and we do it together. And there's got to be a lot of middle ground stuff. I know that a lot of people don't want to be seen to be working with gangs. That's going to kill you business-wise. So in the Lion Academy, we're a global business. I mean, I'm coaching CEOs and dealing with a couple of other leaders all around the world that, they've got organizations. There's more people than in the police force. And so you got to be careful that you're not seen as the guy that's running around going into prisons talking to gang members when you're about to do a multi-million-dollar deal for, mental health training in an American company. But
that's right.
We've got to create this neutral space to have this conversation.
No, Dion, and listen, I'm like you. I'm optimistic, and I'm doing what I'm doing now because I am optimistic, and I believe that we can slowly. The discussions are moving in the right direction, and I think that we will reach the right place where we can actually start to make proper fundamental difference, instead not just little changes on the fringes and small programs here and small programs there, and and programs that aren't united or aren't aligned, or people patch protecting, all this sort of stuff. We've got to try and somehow, we've got some big advantages in our country, is that we're relatively small. We've got our government agencies. There's one government agency that covers the whole country. You haven't got a federal system and a state system and those sorts of things. We've got very strong leadership that sits in all pockets everywhere in the country. It's a matter of us all getting together and getting aligned, and that's the struggle, and that's the challenge. And but I'm optimistic that if we keep having conversations like this, that's going to happen.
Well, you sure as hell don't take someone into battle that doesn't expect to win it, mate. So that's awesome to hear from you. I just want to say a special thank you to you too. You can see you've got the car seat in the back there. You're in the car. You're in between juggling your kids over Christmas like all the rest of us are, except our frontline staff, their work rate increases now. Everyone else is winding down and our frontline staff are increasing.
Totally.
And so like a huge shout out to our serving members, police service, emergency services. If you haven't heard it from anyone else, thank you for your service from us. Like there's a heap of us out here that absolutely love and appreciate what you do. And you probably don't hear it enough, but we do. And it is, I'm going to get $2 swear jar for my kids if they hear me. It is shitty weather out there in some of these places at the moment. And it's going to be some crappy stuff that our people are going to have to deal with. And we absolutely respect them. And look, we mentioned Ron Mark at the start, and I'd like to mention Ron Mark at the end for the no excuses. Ron Mark, foster kid, whited upper, been through hell in his young life through foster homes, ends up in the Sultan of Brunei Special Forces and the Minister for Veterans and Defence in New Zealand.
Yeah.
If he can do it, anyone can do it. And all he says, and this is, I firmly believe this, all you need is one person in your corner to support you and a bloody effective plan to follow, mate.
Absolutely, 100%. Look, you've wrapped it up perfectly in terms of acknowledging all our first responders and frontline staff. They've carried us through this pandemic. They've been asked to do stuff that they never signed up to do. It's been very tough on them, a lot of fatigue, but they've done it to protect the communities, and that's the reason why they've stepped up to do their job. And so just a heartfelt thank you to them. I know they hear it a lot, but we mean it, and the communities mean it. And I know they'll be out there still doing the job when everyone else is trying to have a bit of break over summer. But we are thinking of them, and just want to thank and acknowledge them for the incredible work and service that they do, and their families that sacrifice a lot to allow them to go out and actually do the job that they do. Thanks for having me, Dion. Yeah, I've got the car seat in the back because my daughter is she's up in the Northern Territory teaching in a remote location with her husband, and her husband had a little guy who's been in my life since he was about 1 year old. So I've picked up the granddad duties, and we're down at the tent, which he's been having. They're finished now. They're on their way back, so I'll have to wrap it up and
no worries.
And get home. Listen, mate, just want to acknowledge the incredible work that you're doing. Give your mum a big hug for me for Christmas, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you coming. And anyone watching this, any of the other leaders that are out there in the parties that want to come and have this chat and actually start having this open dialogue, we'd love to have you on here. As you've seen from this interview, we're just asking questions and having these conversations, because you might not talk to each other, but if you see all these interviews, you might set some light bulbs off. There's only one race, is the human race, and there's only one group of people in New Zealand that matters, and that's Kiwis.
100%.
And if we can get to that point, mate, I think we'll be all right.